I was 11 the spring the sky dropped something we were never supposed to talk about. It was late April, 1945. The war lived in the radio and the newspaper, but in our corner of Oregon it felt far away, like thunder you can see but can't quite hear. We had ration books, victory gardens, boys on trains in new uniforms. We did not have bombs. We had fir trees thick as walls, creeks that ran cold all summer, and Sundays that smelled like church starch and peanut butter sandwiches. That Sunday the sky was an uncomplicated blue. We drove past Bly, the truck rattling like it always did, and turned down a dirt track to a clearing we'd visited a dozen times. Mom wore her Sunday dress because she said the Lord deserved effort even on picnics. Dad tuned the Philco low so baseball could keep us company. My sister Ellie brought a kite that had never truly decided to fly, but liked pretending. We spread the blanket, ate, and named shapes in the clouds. I remember nothing unusual. No roar, no flash, just the busy sound of the woods saying we were small and welcome. Ellie and I wandered into the trees to chase a dragonfly. She tripped first. "Watch it," I said, reaching to pull her up. "It's canvas," she said, surprised, brushing dirt from a stubborn tin corner buried in pine needles. We pushed aside needles and found ropes. Then a metal ring, salt dull and heavy, plus a cylinder like a stove that forgot its kitchen. The canvas was singed in places. One flap held writing that wasn't ours, tall, brushy characters I'd seen only on tea tins in Mr. Hamley's store. I didn't know the word Japanese in my bones yet, only from the radio. Ellie looked at me the way sisters do when they're afraid and too proud to say it. "Don't," she warned as my hand went toward the ring. "It's not doing anything," I said. But of course it was. It was refusing to be nothing. "Kids," Dad's voice cut through the trees, steady, not yet worried. "We found something," Ellie called. He came quickly, then slowed when he saw it. Something closed in his face that I had never seen close before. "Don't touch," he said, calm as a locked door. "Step back." We obeyed because the tone was new. He crouched, studied seams and burned edges. The wind lifted the canvas once, and the whole thing seemed to breathe. "Back to the truck," he said, not loud, not gentle, just decided. "Now?" In the bed of the truck, Ellie and I sat with our knees touching, watching the dark between the trees like it might follow him out. He returned with nothing in his hands and everything in his shoulders. "Pack up," he told Mom. "We're heading home." "What about?" she began. "Home," he repeated. He didn't turn the radio on. He drove like the road had become thinner. That night, 2 men arrived. One wore a uniform the color of thought. 2 wore suits that looked like they belonged to bigger towns. They didn't sit in our living room or take pie. They followed Dad to the shed, stayed a while, and left with a folded tarp and a wrapped metal shape. No signatures, no explanation, just a request we would later call an order. Tell no one. At supper, Mom said. They said it was nothing. Dad cut his meat loaf into precise squares and swallowed like he needed the food to push down words. When he thought we were asleep, I heard him whisper, "Balloon. From Japan. Explosives carried by wind." Mom asked, "Did it go off?" He didn't answer, and that was when I learned silence could be louder than truth. 2 days later, the paper ran a short notice. Tragic accident near Klamath. Woman and children killed by unexplained explosion. They did not say balloon. They did not say bomb. They did not say that sky and string can turn into a weapon when you give them enough ocean. Ellie folded the clipping small and slid it under her pillow like a prayer. The men didn't return, but the order stayed. At school, I said nothing. At church, I said nothing. In my head, I said everything. The shape of the ring, the rope fibers that refused to lie flat, the sudden gravity in Dad's eyes. Spring turned to summer as if seasons owed us that much. But whenever a cloud slid across the sun, I felt the woods again and the thing in the trees that had crossed a world to land where we were playing at not being breakable. I can't name the exact moment childhood ended, but if it had a map pin, it would be that clearing, a circle of firs, a patch of sky, a canvas that was not a tent and not a toy and not supposed to be here, breathing with wind that had borrowed its breath from another country. After that day, the sky was never only blue again. Secrets don't just sit still where you leave them. They shift. They follow you. They settle into the quiet between sentences, the gap between knock and answer, breath and reply. After the men in the suits came, we all acted like things had gone back to normal. Dad returned to the garage. Mom clipped coupons like she was saving the country. Ellie painted birds on the margins of her school books. But I noticed things. The way Dad now paused at the tree line behind our house, just for a beat, every time he stepped outside. The way Mom lowered the volume on the radio when news came on, even though she'd always liked to hear it clear. The way Ellie began drawing circles. Not birds, not flowers, just circles. The order not to speak about what we'd seen wasn't just from the government. It came from Dad's eyes. From the way he gripped the steering wheel tighter when we passed the Bly turnoff. From the way he didn't mention the woods anymore, even when the fishing was good. I told my friend Tommy once, tried to anyway. I said, we found a balloon in the trees. Big one, with metal parts. He laughed. You mean a weather balloon? Maybe, I said, but different. He shrugged. My dad says they spy on us from the sky. Maybe it was one of theirs. He said they, with confidence, the way boys do when they know only half of something and think that's all there is. I didn't bring it up again. Not with him. Not with anyone. The war ended that summer. People danced in the streets downtown. The bakery gave out free day-old bread. Our neighbor Mr. Jensen lit firecrackers even though Mom said it was in poor taste. The paper ran the headline. War over. Peace declared. And below that, in smaller letters no one read. 6 dead in Oregon blast still under investigation. That was the only time I ever saw anything close to truth printed. But no one clipped that article. No one folded it and kept it under their pillow. A year passed. Then 2. Dad never mentioned the balloon again. Not at dinner. Not while fixing the truck. Not even when a new family moved into a house near the clearing and he looked at them with something like warning. Ellie asked me once, while we were raking leaves, do you think anyone else ever found one? I don't know, I said. She pressed the rake into the earth and leaned on it like she was waiting to be older. I wonder if the people who made them knew who they'd land on. That sat with me a long time. Not the question. The idea that people might send destruction across oceans without knowing whose hands would touch it, or whose sister would trip on it. High school came. The world got louder, faster. Sputnik beeped its way into orbit, and suddenly the sky wasn't just for clouds anymore. My science teacher said we'd all live in space one day. I remember thinking, we haven't even figured out how to live on the ground. Dad started waking up earlier. He said it was his back, but I'd hear him on the porch before sunrise, just sitting. Sometimes I'd sit with him. We wouldn't talk, but I watched his fingers, how he'd rub his thumb and forefinger together, like he was feeling for something he'd lost in a dream. One morning, I asked him, did it scare you? He looked at me, not startled, just tired. What? The thing in the trees. He didn't answer, just got up and went inside. And that was the last time I asked. In 1958, I got a job delivering mail. Quiet work. Honest work. Sometimes, on my route, I'd pass a bend in the road where you could almost see the edge of that clearing through the trees. I never stopped. But once, I slowed the truck and rolled down the window. The air smelled the same. Pine, dust, memory. I thought I saw something in the brush, just a shape, the color of canvas. But I didn't go look. Because the truth is, I already knew what was there. And sometimes, knowing is enough. It was 1974 when the government finally said it out loud. I was home on a Tuesday night, the TV humming in the corner, one of those grainy, half-sure news reports, when the words caught my ear. Over 9,000 balloon bombs launched from Japan during World War II. Some landed as far inland as Michigan and Montana. A few caused fires. One resulted in civilian casualties near Bly, Oregon. I dropped my coffee. Helen came in from the kitchen, drying her hands. What happened? I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because the world had just said what we'd buried for nearly 30 years. It was real. I spent the rest of that night sitting in the garage, not doing anything, just sitting, listening to the quiet as if it owed me something. I thought about Ellie. She'd moved to New Mexico by then, married a teacher, had kids of her own. She never brought it up after we left home. Maybe she forgot. Maybe she didn't. Maybe she just learned, like the rest of us, that some truths become furniture, always there, but never the thing you talk about. 2 weeks later, I went back to the old house. Mom had passed, Dad a few years earlier. The place was empty, stale with dust and forgotten air. I told Helen I needed to check the attic before we sold it. Instead, I went to the shed. I hadn't stepped inside since the week after the balloon. It smelled like rust and time. There, on the top shelf, behind a stack of old cans, I found it. A wooden box. Unmarked. Heavy. I opened it. Inside, canvas. Frayed. Folded, faintly burned. A metal ring. A small photograph. The clearing, blurred, distant. And a piece of paper in Dad's handwriting. Let them say it wasn't real. We saw it. And it mattered. I stood there with the box in my hands, heart loud in my ears, and all I could think was, he remembered. All these years. He remembered. He never said the words. But he didn't throw it away. And that felt like enough. I showed it to Helen. She didn't ask why I hadn't told her sooner. She just sat next to me and said, "What do you want to do with it?" And I said, without thinking, "Tell someone." My son put me in touch with a local reporter. Young guy, clean notebook, open face. I told him the whole story. He listened, really listened. When I finished, he said, "You're not the only one. There are others. People who saw them, touched them." The government kept it quiet to avoid panic. "Too late for that," I said. He smiled. "Would you be willing to go on the record?" I looked at him, and I said, "It's time someone did." The article ran in the local paper. The man who touched a secret. They included my photo, Dad's note, even a quote from Ellie, who agreed to speak once she knew I had. We got letters. People who remembered rumors. Others who had seen pieces of silk in trees. One woman who said her father had burned something in their backyard in 1945 and never explained why. We weren't alone. Not anymore. The government didn't respond. Didn't have to. But I like to think, somewhere in some gray building, someone clipped that article, folded it, filed it, whispered, they found one. I didn't go back to the clearing until the spring of my 68th year. It had been decades. The trail wasn't marked anymore. The trees had changed, or maybe it was me. But the smell of pine was the same, sharp and grounding, like truth. I parked where the road turned to gravel. Walked the rest on foot. I carried the box. Not because I needed to prove anything. I'd already done that. But because I'd promised myself, after the article, after the letters and the questions and the silence finally breaking open like a long-locked door, that I'd return it to where it had come from. Not as an offering. Not as evidence. Just as closure. The clearing was smaller than I remembered. Childhood makes everything bigger. The tall firs weren't quite as tall. The circle of grass was more tangled now. But I stood in the center and knew, without doubt, that I was exactly where it happened. I sat on a mossy log, opened the box, ran my fingers across the canvas, thinner now, brittle. The ring still felt heavy in my hand. And the photo, even more faded, still showed enough trees to say, this was real. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. Instead, I talked. To the trees. To the sky. To the air that had carried something terrible across an ocean and dropped it into the hands of two children with sandwiches in their backpacks. I told it what happened after. How we'd stayed quiet. How it had shaped everything in ways I didn't understand until years later. I told it about Ellie. How she still drew circles sometimes in the margins of her letters. How she said, just last year, I think I spent my whole life looking up, wondering if anything else would fall. I buried the box. Not deep, just enough to mark the end of something. I didn't bring a stone. Didn't need to. The clearing remembered. When I got home, I took out one of the letters I hadn't replied to. From a young man in Montana who'd read the article. Said his grandfather told a similar story but was dismissed as senile. He wanted to know, should he believe it? I wrote, if your grandfather said he saw something, believe him. Not because he was always right, but because silence doesn't mean false. Sometimes, it just means too heavy to lift alone. I folded it carefully, dropped it in the mailbox. Felt lighter than I had in years. Some months later, a teacher from WWII wrote to me. Said she'd turned my story into a writing prompt for her 8th grade class. Describe a moment when your world changed, it said. She included a few of their answers. One wrote about his parents' divorce. Another wrote about finding a bird's nest knocked from a tree. One girl wrote, sometimes I think the sky is full of things we don't talk about. I want to be someone who does. I don't go back to the clearing anymore. Once was enough. But I keep the photo of it, the one from Dad's box, pinned to my wall. And when the wind moves through the pine trees outside my window, just right. I close my eyes, and for a moment, I'm 11 again. Standing in sunlight, with my sister beside me, and a thing in the trees we didn't yet know could change everything. And maybe that's the thing about stories like this. They don't always need to end loudly. Sometimes, they just need to be heard. Some stories don't need an explosion to echo. Sometimes all it takes is a quiet voice, finally spoken. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of something you never told anyone, or of someone who carried something in silence, then we ask one simple thing. Left Speech Bubble, leave us a comment. Tell us what you remember, what your family never quite said out loud. Because history isn't just what's written in books. It's what's whispered at dinner tables, what's folded in letters no one sends, what's buried in places the world forgot, but you didn't. Subscribe to the channel. Help us keep telling the kinds of stories that still matter. The small, the hidden, the almost lost. Tap the bell. Let the next story find you. Right when you're ready to remember. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story.